I welcome you to the Australian-New Zealand Environmental History Network Conference for 2020, and it's great that we can meet digitally on Zoom, if not having not been able to get together at Geelong this year. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm actually currently on the land of the Gubbi Gubbi people on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, and I'd like to acknowledge all the Indigenous people of the nations on where we are all sitting at the moment. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. Thank you all for joining us. And first of all, we have Heather Goodall. So I'll hand over to Heather to put up her screen and we shall get started. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the beginning of my presentation and it's extremely good to be here. It's great to know that everybody's out there in the audience. I'm talking from Wongal land and this is a talk about the Georges River, which is on Durrock and Dharawal land. And this is a talk about the way that wetlands are understood in this area. Now, I've been working on the Georges River for some time with a number of different partners, Dennis Byrne, Alison Cadzow, for example, Joe Kygis, who's here, I hope. And we've been looking at the various ways that people have understood a particular part of land, which was the Georges River National Park. But I'm looking more broadly this time at the whole length of the estuary. This photograph, to start off with, this first screen, is about the ways, well, the whole talk is about the ways in which wetlands really ceased to be visible in the period when there was a lot of campaigning in the 1960s and 70s about the environment. So what we didn't see were the wetlands, and we didn't hear about the casualties from the reclamation of wetlands which had already taken place. Ruth Staples, whom you can see in the middle photograph, is a spokesperson for the Kiln Bay Preservation Society. This photograph's really important because there are very few images of the women who had a key role in all of these campaigns. But the other two photographs are actually of a wetland area. This is at Mill Creek and the photographer is me. So the first one at the top, you're looking across the rushes of the saltmarsh. You can see some mangroves there and some other salt-tolerant trees behind it. And the third picture is looking down, and you can see through the saltmarsh itself into the wetness of the soil, and you can see how waterlogged it is. So these were large areas along the Georges River, and I'm going to show you next a map. So here we are. This is the Georges River. Joe, you'll recognise this. This is an area that, the area that I'm working in, and it's the area of the estuary. So from that bend, you can see it Chipping Norton up here. It bends around to the south and then heads east into Botany Bay. Many of you will have read the terrific book by Ian Tyrrell about the Cooks River, which is a much smaller river rising here, which heads also into Botany Bay, which is much closer to the city. The Georges River was further away. It actually rises way down south of Campbelltown. And this area here from Liverpool downstream is estuarine. So it's tidal and it's salt, and it has really poor soils, sandy soils, which are not good for farming. Now, these dots reflect wetlands that I'm aware of. I know there are lots more on the Georges River, or there were lots more, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the ones that I've been writing about and looking at. The yellow dots and the red dots are wetlands which had been reclaimed, filled in with sand from the river, dredge from the river, and rubbish by the late 1950s, early 1960s. And you can see there's a lot of yellow and red on this map. And I just wanted to give you a sense of the scale of the destruction. But there's a significant shift that occurs with the Second World War. So the yellow ones here, the one at the top of Saltpan Creek and then the one over here at Voyager Point, are military establishments which have been shifted to to become social housing or migrant worker housing. So they've arisen from the impact of the war itself. The red dots are in the later period, and they reflect an escalation of what had been a long history of filling in wetlands and swampy low-lying lands to make dry land on which to be built or have other things happen. But there's an escalation which begins to occur after the Second World War as the economy shifts and it becomes much more of a consumer economy. The packaging industry expands and there is a really large amount of household garbage which begins to flood the area. It's the responsibility of municipal councils, as you know, along these rivers in suburban areas to dispose of rubbish, to deal with it. And they were increasingly unsure of what on earth they were going to do about it. So this is an escalating issue which is occurring throughout the middle 1960s. The dots that are blue are the places where there were campaigns, there were blues about the reclamation of wetlands. But they're not talked about as the reclamation of wetlands, and I'll explain that in a minute. But the wetland is partially saved because of those campaigns. Those campaigns are really not talked about very much in the history of Australian conservation, and that's the point that I wanted to make. The green dots are ones which were never touched. Mill Creek was partially not important enough. A little bit of Kelso swamp remained, as you'll see. Mill Creek wasn't touched mainly because Lucas Heights nuclear reactor was up here at Menai, and everybody was a little bit cautious about touching it. So it was one of the few things that actually saved the wetlands. Now, the next thing I want to go on to is just to explain to you a little bit more about what happened to Kelso Swamp, and I'll try and be really fast when I do that. Here we are. Here's Kelso Swamp, which is at Milperra, so it's quite a long way upstream from Botany Bay. There's a turf farm which starts in 1928. There's a golf course as golf becomes more fashionable. But even in 1951, when this photograph is taken, it's still quite extensive and there are still lots of birds. But in that same decade, Bankstown Council begins to dump rubbish in the swamp. And the goal is to make playing fields. Playing fields were believed not only to be wanted by organisations within the municipality, but to be very useful for providing discipline for young people. Bankstown is an area, and the Georges River is an area which suffered a massive population increase. It had been a picnic river prior to World War II. With World War II, it became the focus of much of the factory locations and the worker locations for the factories that arose after the post-war planning implementation that began to take place. So by 1964, we've got Bankstown Council has gone into administration by this stage. So we're being told by the administrator of the council that Kelso Swamp used to have lots of birds, but apparently they're disappearing rapidly because the swamp is disappearing rapidly because it's being filled with rubbish. And they're going to produce 15 playing fields. In fact, what exists now at Kelso Swamp is not only playing fields, but a number of other sites like Western Sydney University, the M5, a baseball ground, and a number of other places which have been fitted over this swamp. So the birds have been displaced, is the point that I wanted to make here. The birds had been displaced and there had been increasing anxiety about what had happened to the Cooks River. So people on the Georges River had looked to the north. They had seen the damage done to the Cooks River over many, many decades. There was a deeply disturbing and damaging spill of pesticide which occurred in 1973. All of these cumulative events meant that as people could see the Georges River being impacted by rubbish and the reclamation of wetlands, people began to act, and that's why those blues occurred, a sequence of campaigns. But because birds had gone, wetlands were not really seen. You could see how nondescript the wetlands were in those first photographs. And so what became the focus were mangroves. And mangroves, because the focus was on the land, mangroves were increasingly seen as the focus of both the council campaigns to reclaim low-lying lands and swamplands and the defenders' focus. And you can see that Hurstville Council with Limekiln Bay, and then with Polton Park, Cogra Council, is abusing people in the name of mangroves. So this is Councillor Alderman Mackenzie, who's saying we're not going to call them conservationists, we're going to call them mangrovites, because what they want to do is save a dirty, stinking mass, which is no asset to the community. So who did defend the wetlands? Why is there any still there? And I'll just be a couple more minutes on this. The people who defended the wetlands were still focusing on mangroves. They were picking up the narrative from the whole range of ecological narratives which were beginning to circulate about mangroves being nurseries for immature fish. Now, there's a lot of other things they could have said, but this was a really maternal image which played pretty well. If you couldn't actually have a charismatic species, you could have mangroves looking after little fish. So this is the first campaign I wanted to point to at Great Moon Bay. The idea was to dredge all of those shallow shoals and dump it on the wetland you can see on that western edge of Lugano. And the other big campaign was the campaign to, and that second circle I've got up there is actually around Tara Point, was to put a second airport on Tara Point. Now, the people who defended both Great Moon Bay and the wetlands in Lugano and Tara Point were fishermen. They were commercial fishermen like Bernie Clark, who defended, for the rest of his life, defended Tara Point, and who, as he says there, learnt about birds. He didn't know anything about birds. He didn't know anything about mangroves or vegetation. He learnt about them in the process of this campaign, which was to protect his fishing from the disruption caused by the airport. So the mangrove became the focus, but the outcome was to defend the wetlands. And I'll just take you back to give you an indication of the estuarine wetlands that are there along the river, and there's a lot more as well. So I'll finish there.